Today's gospel from Luke picks up right where we left off last week in Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. This is Luke's rendition of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, and both begin with the Beatitudes. But Luke, remember, adds a section of woes. Right away, Luke makes a distinction between poor and rich. As I prepared my sermon this week, I read a commentary in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary series, and I will touch on it from time to time as we go along. It begins by saying that the first part of Jesus' sermon deals with the, quote, assurance of God's blessing on the poor with whom the Christian community closely identifies, and conversely, God's judgment on the rich who persecute the community, unquote. For those in Luke's community listening to this sermon or us reading it, it might feel nice to hear, especially if we identify with that group. We, the poor, the meek, the hungry, the thirsty, are finally going to get what we deserve. And they, the rich, the oppressive, the full and satisfied, are finally going to get what they deserve. The tables are turning, and they like what they hear. But don't rejoice just yet, because Jesus has more to say. Jesus sets us up with the Beatitudes and woes because it gives us a hope that the lowly will be raised up and the mighty will be thrown down. And yes, ultimately that will happen if we listen to Jesus and do what he commands. But the reality is this is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to just be handed to those who long for it. It takes work and action on the part of the people. We have a hand in this. Maybe not what those thirsting for righteousness want to hear. Remember last week when Deacon CJ was preaching on trusting in God, CJ said, and I won't do it with the same elegance he did it, but CJ said, the Beatitudes are scandalous, countercultural, counterintuitive, and contradistinctive. These statements run counter to the societal norms and the status quo. But God's pattern of love for the world can be trusted. It really works when we work it, live it, and tell it. God's pattern of love for the world can be trusted. Hold that thought. I'll come back to it in a minute. It takes action on our part. That becomes so much more evident in the next section of Jesus' sermon, the section we heard today. Just in that moment when the people think there is hope to foil the plans of the rich and powerful, Jesus says, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. And finally, he says, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Wait, what? Love our enemies? You just said, woe to those who are powerful and mighty, and you want us to love them? Do you realize the things they do to others? Do you realize the place of privilege they hold over others? And I can just picture Jesus looking at them and saying, yes, but love them anyway. How? By taking action in two ways. By loving and by forgiving. We act through love and we act through reconciliation. That's what it's all about. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. But that is hard. We want to strike back. We want to make them feel as they made us feel. This part of Jesus' sermon makes it clear that, as I read in the commentary, there is no place in the Christian ethic for vengeance and retaliation. We are instructed to love, do good, bless, and pray. We are not instructed to seek revenge or retaliate, especially through violence. We are further instructed to aggressively stand up to violence and oppression through the 4 illustrations Jesus gives. Turn the other cheek. Do not withhold your shirt. Give to the one who asks of you. And if your goods are taken, do not ask for them back. He then invokes the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. The commentary I read pointed out that the part of giving to the one who asks of you most likely is not referring to a generous response of one who begs for help, but rather a willing compliance to the requests of one who is more powerful. Likewise, losing one's shirt is not meant in a theft scenario, but in a legalistic way. Do not return evil for evil, but love, not hate. Respond with love, not evil. This is exactly what we see in the story of Joseph and his brothers today. Here is a story where you might think Joseph has every right to lash out at his brothers and gain his revenge for what they did to him. And remember the story. They were angry at him because they felt he was saying that he was better than they were. They were jealous of him because they felt their father loved him more than the rest of them. They capture him, throw him into a deep hole, and sell him off into slavery. Then they lie to their father and say he has been killed by a wild beast. Now, years later, Joseph has the chance to confront them, to get even. But what does he do? He loves them. Now, I'm not going to say he didn't have a little bit of fun with them before he told them who he was, because he did. But he didn't harm them. He loved them too much. He gives their money back. He cares for them and ultimately moves them to be with him so that he can save them from the famine. The brothers are amazed, as is their father Jacob, when they find out, because they can't believe it's him. Joseph loves them and reassures them that they did not do wrong, but God brought him to Egypt so that he could save them and care for them. God's pattern of love for the world can be trusted. He trusted in God. He did not return evil for evil, but he gave love. Again, loving is active. It takes doing. To love something or someone takes action on our part because we give a piece of who we are to make them know that they are worth it. To love means we show others they are worth it, even if they don't necessarily deserve it. Joseph shows love. He does something. It's about reconciliation, loving and forgiving. Now back to Luke. Jesus has just given those 4 illustrations, and you've heard me talk about this section before, and I want you to understand that many misinterpret what Jesus is asking us to do here. Jesus tells us to love our enemies, do good, bless, pray for them, and then he says, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other one also. If they take your coat, give them your shirt also. I think too many people think of this as being passive, as saying don't do anything. People might hear a story about how something bad is happening to someone and they'll say, turn the other cheek, suggesting you just walk away and not do anything. It's not about being passive. It is about standing up to injustice. It is being aggressive in a non-violent way. It is precisely about taking action, not in an evil way, but in a way to show the error of their ways. It is about standing up for yourself against the oppressor. It is stopping the cycle of violence. The people in Luke's time would have understood what Jesus was saying because they understood the law at the time. When somebody strikes you, they were only allowed to strike you with the back of their hand, because to strike you with the front of their hand was battery and was against the law. So if you had just been struck on the cheek with a backhanded slap, offering the other cheek meant they would have to swing forward to strike you, and that would break the law. By turning the other cheek, you are literally forcing their hand. It's the same idea with giving your coat and shirt. If someone sued you and took you to court, they could take your coat, but not your shirt. because it was illegal to take away your last garment and to leave you standing there naked. Jesus is not saying to be passive when it comes to those who oppress others, but be active in standing up to injustice. You are not returning evil for evil. You are loving them by showing them the error of their ways and hopefully helping them to realize their need to change their ways and stop their injustice. Now, I want to be clear about something. There are definitely actions and abuses that go way beyond what Jesus is talking about here. There are actions and abuses that are criminal and need to be dealt with in a very different way. I understand that, and I'm not trying to make light of that. Here, Jesus is teaching about love. Love one another. Be kind to one another. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And if we all did this, there wouldn't be a need to stand up to injustices, a need to fight oppression. If we simply loved one another, imagine how the world would be a different place, a better place. And what's stopping us? What's keeping us from hearing the words of Jesus and doing what he says? Love your enemies, just like you would love your neighbors. And it just builds from there. If you are loving, there is no room to judge others, no room to condemn others, no room to not forgive others. Give, and it will be given back. I want to share one more part from the commentary I read. It says that the first and second parts of Jesus' sermon to his followers suggest two problems for modern Christians. Quote, the repudiation of privilege based on wealth and the repudiation of retaliation that spawns violence. Jesus' alternative is not sheer passivity, but aggressive action to undermine hostility and violence. He taught a new attitude toward possessions and persons in need and a new response to hostility, oppression of the poor, materialism, and the presumption that problems can be settled by violence and force are all related. Jesus' teachings to his disciples, therefore, call for imaginative, aggressive, but non-violent responses to the problems that have borne such bitter fruit in our own time. Unquote. Jesus doesn't just teach these things to the disciples and others. He does them as well. He lives them out in his death on the cross. He doesn't judge those who crucified him. He doesn't condemn them. He forgives them, and he loves them. He shows the greatest love of all because he gives himself, literally, so that we might understand that love and learn to actively show that love to others, even our enemies. Jesus teaches us, even today, to understand this, that in loving we are conquering evil. But it's still hard. Jesus says it's easy to love those who love you, but it is so much harder to love those who don't. But we are to love them anyway. Jesus says it's easy to give when you think you will get something in return, but harder to give when you know you will get nothing in return. But give anyway. What you'll find is that the more you give, the more you will be given. And the more you love, the more you will be loved in return. That is not why you do it, but I believe it is what happens. There are many evils in the world today, many injustices that need to be stopped. But how? Well, we start by showing love. We start by standing up and answering evil with love, answering hate with love, answering injustice with love. But we have to actually start. Let's start by loving, which leads to understanding, which leads to healing, which leads to peace, and so on, until it all leads back again to love. Let's start by loving ourselves, our neighbors, our enemies. Let's start by loving, and let's start now. Amen.